The machine beeped 3 times before Eliana Moore opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling tiles, white, cracked at the corner, stained yellow near the light fixture. The 4-needle in her arm had been there long enough that she'd stopped feeling it. Her head still throbbed with that deep, bone-level ache that had finally brought her here after weeks of pretending it wasn't real. The curtain beside her bed swayed from the air conditioning, and somewhere down the hall, a child was crying softly for their mother. Then her phone rang. She already knew who it was before she looked at the screen. Raymond. His name came out of her mouth the way you say a word you've repeated so many times it loses all meaning. She answered, "Eliana." His voice was clipped, businesslike, the same tone he used with his staff. "How long are you planning to be there?" She blinked. "I'm still on the drip, Raymond. The doctor said. I have the Hendersons coming for dinner tonight. You know that. I told you last week." A pause. "I need you home by 4. The machine beside her beeped again. She looked at it because she didn't know where else to look. "Raymond," I collapsed. "In the grocery store parking lot. They still don't know." "Eliana." His voice dropped, quiet and cold in the way that always stopped her mid-sentence. "I'm not asking you to run a marathon. I'm asking you to come home and make dinner. Surely that's not too much." She said nothing. "I'll send the car at 3:30, he said, and then he was gone. She set the phone down on the blanket and lay there for a long moment, listening to her own breathing, watching the curtain sway. Outside the window, birds were moving through the tree branches. The morning sun was soft and pale, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look almost beautiful. She thought, he didn't ask how I feel. Not once. Not even to perform it. That thought had crossed her mind before, briefly like a shadow, but always disappeared quickly beneath the weight of routine. This time it didn't disappear. It sat there, quiet and stubborn, pressing gently against her ribs. If you're already watching this story and you feel it in your chest, go ahead and subscribe, because this channel delivers stories that speak to real life. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. Before the car arrived, the nurse helped Eliana into a wheelchair and pushed her slowly toward the elevator. They passed through the courtyard garden on the ground floor, a small patch of greenery the hospital had planted to give patients somewhere peaceful to sit. 2 elderly people were there, a man and a woman, both white-haired, both moving slowly. The woman was laughing at something the man had said, her hand pressed against her chest like his words had delighted her. He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back, gently, without thinking about it. Just a reflex, just tenderness. Eliana watched them from the wheelchair and felt something break quietly inside her chest. She had been married for 31 years. She could not remember the last time Raymond had touched her face. She could not remember the last time he had laughed with her. Not at a party, not for show, but really privately, the way people do when they're completely at ease with each other. She pressed her lips together and looked away. The car came at 3:30, exactly as Raymond had said. By 4 o'clock she was home, still dizzy, still carrying the headache like a stone behind her eyes. She went directly to the kitchen because that was what you did. You came home and you started the work. She moved carefully, chopping vegetables, seasoning the lamb, setting the table with the good silverware. The house was immaculate already because Eliana kept it that way out of habit. Cream-colored walls, polished hardwood floors, flowers arranged on the console table in the entryway the way Raymond liked. Everything in its place. Everything exactly so. She was setting the last wine glass when she noticed something on the shelf in the living room that hadn't been there before. A small velvet box, dark burgundy, tucked between the candles. She set the glass down and crossed to it. Picked it up. Inside was a pearl bracelet on a gold clasp, elegant and simple. Their anniversary was on Saturday. Eliana sat down on the arm of the sofa and held the box in both hands. She couldn't remember the last time he had given her something like this. Something chosen, something that required thought. A small, fragile hope pressed up through the grief she'd been carrying all day. She told herself, maybe he still sees me. Maybe things can still be different. She set the box back carefully in exactly the same position and returned to the kitchen. Raymond came home at 8:45, long after the Hendersons had gone. Eliana had kept the plate warm for him. She heard his keys, heard his shoes come off at the door, heard him move through the hallway. She called from the kitchen, "Your dinner's ready. I kept it. I ate with the Hendersons after." His voice came through the wall, disinterested. "We went to Morrison's." She stood at the counter with the warm plate in her hand. "Oh," she said. He didn't come into the kitchen. She heard the television come on in the sitting room, the low murmur of a sports channel. She stood there another moment, then quietly scraped the food into the bin, rinsed the plate, and turned off the light. She walked past the velvet box on her way upstairs. She didn't look at it. She was invisible in her own home. She had been for years. It was just that tonight, for the first time, she could feel the edges of that truth pressing outward, wanting out. Over the next 3 weeks, things that Eliana had trained herself not to notice suddenly became impossible to ignore. Raymond was arriving home later. He'd never been an early man. Business demanded evenings, but this was different. This was 2, sometimes 3 in the morning. Quiet in a way that meant he didn't want to be heard. Once, she reached over in the dark and touched the sleeve of the shirt he'd draped over the chair. There was a smell she didn't recognize. Not cologne, she knew his cologne. Something else. Lighter. Floral. She lay in the dark and breathed evenly and did not cry. The next morning, she tried. "Raymond." She stood in the kitchen doorway while he had his coffee. "Is everything all right? You've been coming home very late." He didn't look up from his phone. "Work. It's been weeks." "Eliana." Now he looked at her, patient, like she was a child asking a foolish question. "The Mercer account is worth $2.6 million. Would you like me to explain to you what's involved in that, or—" "I'm not asking about the account." She kept her voice steady. "I'm asking about you. About us." Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, she thought. More like calculation. He set his coffee down. "I think your hospital stay rattled you," he said. "You've been emotional. Maybe you should see someone. Dr. Pierce." "I don't need a therapist, Raymond. I'm asking you a question. And I'm answering it." He picked his keys up from the counter. "Everything is fine. Stop looking for problems." He was out the door before she could form the next sentence. She stood in the empty kitchen and listened to his car pull away. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the counter and breathed. She hadn't been wrong. She was sure of that. Something was shifting beneath the surface of their life, and she could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. But she had no proof. And Raymond had always been very good at making her question herself. Let's take a moment right here. If this story is speaking to you, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Now let's go back to where it all began. Eliana had grown up in a house where nothing was stable. Her father had lost his construction business when she was 9. After that, money came and went in waves. Sometimes her mother would buy groceries freely. Sometimes they ate crackers and tinned soup for 2 weeks. Her father's moods moved the same way. She learned to read rooms before she entered them. She learned to be quiet. By the time she was 20, quiet had become her default language. That was the year she met Raymond Cole at a church social event. He was 26, already managing a small commercial property firm, already wearing confidence like a second skin. He told her she had a calming presence. He told her she was the kind of woman a man could build something with. She had never heard anything like that before. Not about her, not aimed at her with such directness. 6 months later, she gave him $25,000. Her grandmother's inheritance, the only money she had ever held in her name alone. She gave it to him because he had a business opportunity that required capital, and she believed in him the way you believe in things when you are 20 years old and someone has finally looked at you like you matter. He said, "I'll never forget this." They married the following year. And for a little while, maybe 2-3 years, there was real warmth between them. She remembered a Saturday morning when he'd made breakfast and they'd sat on the back step of their first apartment and talked for 2 hours about nothing. She remembered laughing until her stomach hurt. But the business grew. and Raymond's time and attention moved toward it with the focus of a man who had decided what he was willing to sacrifice. Eliana's ambitions, she had wanted to study interior design, had been quietly talented at it, faded without anyone acknowledging their disappearance. When she got pregnant with Adrian, she stopped working. When she got pregnant again with Devin 2 years later, the idea of returning to anything of her own had quietly closed like a door. She became the house. She became the meals, the schedules, the social calendar, the school runs, the everything that made Raymond's public life appear seamless. And Raymond accepted it all with the ease of a man who never thought to ask what it cost her. Her headaches had started 4 years ago. Small things at first, pressure behind the eyes, sensitivity to light. She mentioned it once to Raymond, and he said she probably needed new glasses. She got new glasses. The headaches continued. She stopped mentioning them. The morning the hospital called with her test results, she was alone in the house. She sat down at the kitchen table to take the call, because she somehow knew she should be seated. Mrs. Moore. The doctor's voice was steady, the practiced steadiness of someone who delivers news like this regularly. We've reviewed your MRI results carefully, and I want to speak with you directly. We've found a mass, a tumor, in the left temporal lobe. Based on the imaging, it's at an advanced stage. We'd like you to come in today with your family, so we can discuss your options. Eliana set her coffee cup down on the table very carefully so it didn't rattle. Advanced, she said. Stage 3, the doctor said. Aggressive in type, but there are treatment pathways. I don't want you to hear this and assume. How long? She asked. If I do everything right. How long? A pause. With treatment, we're looking at 3 to 5 years. Possibly more. But we need to move quickly. She thanked him. She hung up. She sat at the table for a very long time without moving. Outside, a bird landed on the garden fence, looked around, and flew away. That evening, when she told Raymond and both sons, Adrian had driven over, Devin had called in, the conversation fractured almost immediately. Devin said, "What does this mean for the house? If treatment costs?" Adrian cut in, "Devin, stop." Raymond stood with his arms crossed, jaw set. "There are good oncologists. We'll get the best. I'll handle it." Raymond. Her voice came out quieter than she expected, but firm. "I'd like to speak, please." He looked at her with mild surprise. In 31 years, she had said that exactly twice. "I want everyone to listen to me," she said. "Not about money. Not about logistics. I want you to look at me and understand that I am telling you I am unwell. I want someone in this room to ask me how I feel." Silence. Adrian looked at the floor. Devin looked at his phone. Raymond uncrossed his arms but said nothing. She looked at her husband of 3 decades and understood something she had been approaching slowly for months. He did not know how to love her. He had never learned. And she had spent 31 years making that his problem bearable for everyone else. "I want a divorce," she said. Raymond blinked. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Eliana, I mean it. You've just received a diagnosis. You're not thinking clearly. I am thinking more clearly than I have in 30 years. She met his eyes steadily. "I don't say this in anger. I say it because I have perhaps 3 years left, and I will not spend them the way I've spent the last 3 decades. Raymond shook his head slowly. "You need me. You cannot manage alone." I've been managing alone the entire time," she said. "I just haven't been alone while doing it." The room went very quiet after that. Even Devin put his phone down. It was 3 months later when everything came apart in public. Raymond's company was hosting an end-of-year function at the Larkin Hotel. A large affair, 200 guests, champagne and a string quartet and speeches. Eliana had organized it, as she organized everything. She wore a deep blue dress and arrived early. Within the first 20 minutes, 2 separate guests, people who had been to their home for dinner, approached her near the appetizer table and asked her if she could bring more napkins. She stood there with a glass of sparkling water in her hand, dressed in a gown, and 2 people who knew her name thought she was staff. She did not correct them. She simply smiled and gestured toward the catering manager nearby. Then she saw Sabrina Vale. She'd seen Sabrina before, of course. Raymond's assistant for the past 4 years. Efficient, well-dressed, professionally warm. But tonight Sabrina was beside Raymond in a way that wasn't professional. It was the small things. The way she laughed at something he said and touched his arm. The way he leaned toward her slightly when they spoke. The way they moved through the room together without any of the choreography of colleagues. Just ease, just familiarity. Eliana watched from across the room and felt something in her chest go completely still. She was not devastated. She had, on some level, already known. What surprised her was that the knowing brought clarity, not collapse. The last string holding her to uncertainty had simply snapped, and without it, she felt strangely light. Raymond found her later, beside the window. "You look tense," he said. "I'm fine," she said. He followed her gaze toward Sabrina across the room. His expression didn't change. "She's been invaluable this quarter," he said, casually, watching for her reaction. "I'm sure," Eliana said. She turned to look at him then. "Really look. The way you look at something you're preparing to leave." She saw the gray at his temples, the expensive watch, the careful public face he'd been polishing for 30 years. She saw how little of it had ever been for her. "Enjoy your evening, Raymond," she said, and she walked away. 6 weeks later, Raymond ended up in the hospital. It happened at a company retreat weekend. Too much whiskey, a fall on the terrace steps, a broken wrist and bruised ribs. Eliana heard about it through Adrian, who called her at 7 in the morning, his voice tight. "He's asking for you," Adrian said. "Is he stable?" "Yes, he's fine." Just a pause. "He's asking for you, Mama." She drove to the hospital. She found his room. She pushed open the door and there was Raymond, sitting up against the hospital pillows with his wrist in a cast, and Sabrina in the chair beside his bed, still wearing the previous evening's clothes, her shoes off. The room went completely silent. Sabrina moved to stand. Raymond opened his mouth. Eliana set her handbag down on the table by the door, calmly, and looked between them. "Don't," she said, just the one word. She was not angry. She was finished. She sat in the remaining chair and folded her hands in her lap. "I came," she said, "because Adrian called me and I am still his mother. I am still the woman who has organized your life for 30 years. I came because despite everything, that is who I am." She looked at Raymond directly. "And I came because I have something for you to sign." She reached into her bag and placed the envelope on the bed beside his cast. Raymond stared at it. "Eliana, divorce papers," she said simply. "My lawyer prepared them. They're fair. The house goes to you. I want only what was agreed in our original arrangement." A pause. "And I want my inheritance back. The $25,000 I gave you before we married. Adjusted for 30 years, my lawyer has calculated a fair figure. It's outlined in the document. You can't be serious." His voice shifted into the low, warning register she had learned to fear for most of her adult life. "You're sick. You need support. I need you to sign," she said. "Today, if possible." Sabrina had backed against the wall near the window, arms crossed, silent. Raymond looked at the envelope, then at Eliana. She watched him cycle through his options. Anger, appeal, manipulation, authority. She watched him try each one silently with his expression and find no purchase, because she was no longer the woman who needed any of them to stop. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. He read for a long moment, and then, slowly, with the hand that wasn't in a cast, he signed. He signed as if he thought it wasn't real, as if he was confident she would come back. She could see it in his face, that settled certainty that she would break, that she'd always broken before. She took the papers back. She picked up her handbag. "Take care of yourself, Raymond," she said, and she left. She did not run. She did not cry in the elevator or in the parking lot. She sat in her car for a few minutes with the papers in her lap and the early morning light coming through the windshield, and she breathed. In and out, slow and deliberate. She was 61 years old. She had perhaps 3 years. She had signed papers that released her from 30 years of silence. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was sitting in her own life. She went home that afternoon and packed one suitcase. She walked through each room slowly. The kitchen where she had cooked 10,000 meals. The sitting room where she had watched Raymond's business associates fill the sofas while she refilled drinks and laughed at the right moments and disappeared before the important conversations began. The bedroom where she had lain awake for years in the dark, listening to his breathing, feeling more alone than any solitude she could have chosen for herself. She stood in the doorway of Adrian's old bedroom for a moment, the soccer trophies still on the shelf, the faded poster of some footballer he'd loved at 17. She thought about who she might have been if she'd had more space to be someone while still being their mother. She thought about all the ordinary small joys she'd buried because there was always something more pressing, always someone who needed more. She picked up her suitcase. She walked out the front door. She did not look back at the house. Not because she didn't feel it, she felt all of it, but because she'd made a decision, and decisions you go back on before you reach the car are not decisions. They're performances. This was not a performance. Willow Ridge was 6 hours northeast, a small community outside the city where Eliana had spent a single weekend 15 years ago at a friend's retreat. She had remembered it the way you remember places where you accidentally felt like yourself. The long, flat fields going gold in the afternoon, the old shop fronts, the sound of actual silence that is full of birds and wind rather than empty of life. She rented a small cottage near the edge of the town. 2 bedrooms, a garden that had gone to seed, a wooden porch that faced east and caught the morning light. She paid 3 months in advance. She unpacked her one suitcase into the wardrobe and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the overgrown garden and thought, that's where I'll start. She started the following morning. She didn't know much about gardening. She bought a book from the small shop in town. She bought seeds and a trowel and gloves. She knelt in the soft earth in the early mornings while the air was still cool, and she dug and planted and watered and occasionally killed things and eventually, slowly, watched things grow. She introduced herself to the woman across the lane, whose name was Bertie and who was 74 and whose back made it difficult to carry her groceries. She introduced herself to the man 3 doors down who ran the town's small hardware store and whose wife had passed the previous winter and who was clearly floundering through meals. She began cooking twice what she needed and taking the rest next door. She began driving Bertie to the market on Wednesdays. She began sitting on the porch in the evenings when the light turned gold and orange across the fields. And she read, which she had not done for pleasure in 20 years. There was no performance required here. No table to set correctly, no mood to manage, no version of herself to maintain for someone else's comfort. She was simply Eliana, learning, helping, resting, present. Her treatment had begun. Monthly trips back to the city for the clinic, medication that made her tired for several days afterward. She was honest with Bertie about it. Bertie, who had buried 2 husbands and 1 son, took the information and then squeezed Eliana's hand and said, "Then we'll make it a good time, won't we?" It was not a question. Eliana had not cried when she received her diagnosis. She had not cried when she signed the divorce papers. But the night after Bertie said those words to her, she sat at the kitchen table and wept for a long time. Not from grief exactly, but from the strange accumulated relief of being around someone who simply accepted her. She began planning a small community shop. Not large, something modest, a space for local crafts and produce, a place people could gather on Saturday mornings. She spent evenings at the kitchen table with notebooks, sketching layouts, looking up licensing requirements, asking at the town council. People were encouraging. People were interested. She had purpose, and it was wholly, entirely her own. The years that followed were not without pain. Her treatment was difficult at intervals. There were months where fatigue pinned her inside, where her body reminded her of its limits in ways she could not ignore. But she managed it on her own terms, at her own pace, surrounded by people who had chosen to be in her life rather than those who had simply found her convenient. Raymond, she heard through Adrian, had not recovered well from her leaving. The house felt different without her. He reported this with visible discomfort, as though unable to understand why a building should feel different simply because someone was gone. Sabrina, it emerged, had not wanted the domestic life. She wanted Raymond, the executive, the achievement, the power. Raymond, the man rattling around in a large house, quieter than he'd been in years, was apparently less appealing. She left within a year. Devon remained close to his father. Adrian did not. Adrian visited Eliana in Willow Ridge on a Thursday in October, the second year she was there. He sat on her porch and drank tea and looked at her garden and didn't say very much for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mama, for not seeing." She looked at him, her oldest, who had Raymond's jaw and her own eyes. She thought about all the years she had made herself smaller so he and Devon could move freely in a house shaped entirely by their father's personality. She thought about what it cost a child to grow up not knowing that a person's needs go unmet right in front of you. "You see now," she said. "That's what matters." She passed away on a Wednesday in spring, in her cottage in Willow Ridge, with Bertie asleep in the chair beside her bed and the window open to the garden she had planted from nothing. She was 66 years old. She had outlived her prognosis by a year and 4 months, which her oncologist noted with quiet professional surprise. She had in those last years helped establish the community shop, which was still running. She had become, without intending to, the kind of person that people in small places remember, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the specific quality of her attention. Because she listened. Because she showed up. Adrian drove to Willow Ridge when he got the call. He walked through her cottage and found the notebooks on the table, layouts, plans, lists, a journal she had kept sporadically since her second year there. He sat at her kitchen table for a long time reading it. There was an entry near the end that he read twice. She had written, "I spent 30 years learning how to disappear. I spent 5 years learning how to be found. The second kind of living is harder and louder and far more frightening, and I would choose it every time." She was buried beneath a tree at the edge of the Willow Ridge churchyard, a large oak that had been there longer than the town. Bertie organized the flowers. Adrian organized the rest. A number of people from the town came who had no formal connection to her family, who simply came because she had mattered to them in small, ordinary, irreplaceable ways. There was no grand reckoning for Raymond, no dramatic moment of realization. He grew older in the large house, a little quieter each year. If he understood what he had lost, he had no way of saying it that reached anyone else. Some men carry their failures loudly. Raymond carried his in silence, which perhaps was the thing he had always deserved. Adrian went home and changed something. He was not sure exactly what, a way of speaking to his own wife, a habit of asking instead of assuming, a willingness to be present in rooms he would previously have passed through without seeing anyone inside them. He could not undo what had shaped him, but he could choose, every day, what to do with the shape he'd been given. That is the whole of the story. A woman who disappeared slowly and then found herself all at once, quietly, in a garden she had grown with her own hands. If you stayed until the end of the story, thank you. It means more than you know. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We want to hear from you. If Eliana's story moved you, share this video with someone who might need it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Stories like this one come every week, and you don't want to miss them. Eliana Moore lived. In the end, she really lived.